largely to give lectures and so forth, but having many conversations with parish priests and with parishioners and meeting new converts and all this kind of stuff. And I had a moment during one of my visits earlier this year where the priest and the pastor and then his assistant pastor, and actually I think there were a couple of other priests in the room that were attached as well to that church. They asked me, what are you seeing in various churches as you visit them? What are people doing in terms of catechism? What's your sense of what's going on? And it occurred to me then to ask the priest. I want you to imagine, Father, in your head, your best parishioners, like the ones that are ideal. They're doing all the things that you preach about. They're following the instructions you give in confession. They are listening to your counsel. They are taking the actions that you have said, right? Now imagine that person, all of their features and so forth. And I said, now, is that what you're teaching in catechism? Is that what you're teaching? Are you teaching them to be like that? And at that point, the priest looks over at his assistant pastor and goes, huh, which, says to me, I mean, I'm sure in very good faith and probably with a lot of acumen, they've been teaching all of these good things. I mean, these are good things. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that people should not know the content of the ecumenical councils. Absolutely. If you have the capability of understanding what's in the councils, you should. But it is also the case, it is undeniable that the path to the kingdom of heaven does not require that kind of knowledge. It doesn't.
No, you're absolutely right. And I guess one of the things that, because, I myself run an online catechism, and I suppose it would be guilty, although I make it very, very clear from the beginning that ultimately the Orthodox life is not what we're about to explore. And I try to repeat that as we go through the
Yeah.
material. I teach the material because I love it and it's interesting, but constantly with reference back to what you've just said.
Yeah. I mean, I've done the Orthodoxy 101 thing. I mean, for most of the years that I was pastoring, that's what I did
Right.
because that's what I had received, and that's what everybody else was doing.
Mm.
But I think that I have come to the conclusion that catechism should be much more like job training than it is like an academic class. Um, it's interesting. You say, you tell people like, okay, the real life is this. This is, and I know about another priest who apparently what he would always say, okay, now in this class, you're going to learn about the Orthodox life. You're not going to learn the Orthodox life. And I mean, on the one level, like that's great, right? But if you're particularly, it would be hard to do probably with online catechism, but with in-person catechism, there's no reason that you have to just live with that tension.
Mhm.
People like me who work on the internet largely and talk into cameras and microphones and write stuff and so forth. The best that I can ever offer anyone is a supplement,
Mhm.
right? The best that I can offer them is to point at the thing that they should be doing. But a parish priest, a parish catechist, a godparent, what they can offer is, okay, here's how you do this. Number one, let's stand in front of the icons. This is how you make the sign of the cross. This is how you bow. This is how you get up in the morning and say your prayers, especially on the days when you don't feel like it. Like right now, you're brand new. Welcome. You're very happy to do this every day. But eventually, a year or two down the line, you're going to kind of go every so often, maybe most days, um, you know, and here's how you here's how you meditate.
Mhm.
Okay, now everybody, let's do this together. We're going to turn the lights down, maybe light one candle, and one person is going to repeat the Jesus prayer. And all the rest of us are going to attempt the extremely difficult practice of listening to no other thought than this one person's voice. Let's just try that for 5 minutes, right? You can't do that, right? You can't do that on over Zoom, really.
Right.
There's no way to make that work, right? Um, let's sit down and look at your finances and figure out the way that's practical and good for you to use your money for the kingdom of God. You know, all of these things that are the practical life. Again, like the good parishioner, the ideal parishioner, like the way, how do they live? What are they doing in the parish? How are they engaging with parish life? What are they doing outside of the parish? What do you do when you're trying to do prayers together as a family and you've got a 2-year-old who will not sit still? Like, do you make him sit down? Do you let him run around at your feet? All of these things that, sure, we can talk about, but when you've got a dad or a mom there who you watch her go in and out of the service over and over and over and over and over and over again. And she's then talking about how much she loves being an Orthodox Christian. And here's what we do with our kids. That is a powerful kind of catechism that you cannot give with a screen or the microphone or, okay, everybody, welcome to our class. This is the formation. And it's interesting to me, like, if you look at, um, catechetical lectures from the early church, or like the Didache, the earliest known kind of catechetical text, most of what they're about in many cases is how to live the right way, like moral living, which is completely understandable in the context, which is, okay, they're talking to people who last week were pagans, who last week, the idea of not having sexual elements in their religious practice, that would have been weird. Like, of course, that's what everyone does. That's part of our spiritual experience, the idea of that. Oh, by the way, women are people too. Kids are people too. That's crazy to pagans, right? So it makes sense that would be the way that catechism went in the early church. And then also, um, a lot of the instruction was, for instance, okay, this is what baptism is and does to you, for instance, this is what the divine liturgy is and does to you. It's really much more this kind of 3D life. Um, a lot of what we think of as catechism now is a result of debates that occurred because of heresies that grew up, which it's important that we know what the church teaches about these things. That's absolutely important. But knowing that stuff is not the core of the Christian life. The core of the Christian life is faithfulness. And I've been thinking a lot about, like, okay, well, what do we do then? What is all this? Where does all this lead? And I mean, the conclusion I've come to, and I'm still working out my thoughts about this. I'm still having conversations with people about this. This is my task, is to is to chat with people. But I think that one of the things that's often missing is, when people show up at our doors, we often assume that they know the gospel, that they've been convinced of the gospel, and they may not be. They might not know it at all, or they might be convinced by some other gospel or some version of it that's off. So I think that number one is that people need to be evangelized, that they need to have the gospel preached to them when they first come.
Before you
You
go
know?
on, I think that naturally leads me into something I wanted to present to you, because everything you've just said about catechesis, I find actually quite invigorating. I can see how I would implement something like that, where, in my context. And it makes me think of catechesis then in really three parts, the bulk of which would be what I'll call part two, which is everything you've just described. Part one being the Orthodox 101 thing, just so that people know what it is they're encountering in the first place, and then the what, the content of what it is they're encountering. But then the third is one that I see in far too many instances being neglected, and that is the pastoral catechesis, by which I mean fundamentally just good pastoral care,
Yeah.
incarnational pastoral care, where the priest is present not simply as a liturgy machine, not simply as a director of feast days or whatever, but rather somebody who is present with people in the midst of their own existential questions and crises. And that I do find sorely lacking. It's certainly something I've seen gravely lacking in other communities.
Yeah.
But it hurts when I see it lacking in Orthodox communities.
Yeah.
And I suppose one step, the initial step to addressing that need is to make sure people are well grounded in the gospel, because of course the incarnate Logos, Jesus Christ, is the supreme sort of pastor and is the supreme answer to any existential question.
Yeah.
But of course, the priest needs to substantiate that in his ministry, and not the priest alone, but we're talking, here about, the church's
Yeah.
structure.